Hey everybody, this video is called Jehu Reforms, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, where we're going to be looking at the reforms of Jehu. And so we're going to read a pretty lengthy part starting out in the chapter here, chapter 10, verse 1 through 11. It says, "Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, and Jehu wrote and sent letters to Samaria, to the rulers of Jezreel, to the elders, and to those who reared Ahab's sons, saying, Now as soon as this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses, a fortified city also, and weapons, choose the best qualified of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. But they were exceedingly afraid, and said, Look, 2 kings could not stand up to him. How then can we stand? And he who was in charge of the house, and he who was in charge of the city, the elders also, and those who reared the sons, sent to Jehu, saying, We are your servants. We will do all you tell us, but we will not make anyone king. Do what is good in your sight. Then he wrote a second letter to them, saying, If you are for me and will obey my voice, take the heads of the men, your master's sons, and come to me at Jezreel by this time tomorrow. Now the king's sons, 70 persons, were with the great men of the city, who were wearing them. So it was, when the letter came to them, that they took the king's sons and slaughtered 70 persons, put their heads in baskets, and sent them to Jezreel. Then a messenger came and told him, saying, They have brought the heads of the king's sons. And he said, Lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning. So it was in the morning that he went out and stood and said to all the people, You are righteous indeed. I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these? Know now that nothing shall fall on the earth of the word of the Lord which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he spoke by his servant Elijah. So Jehu killed all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all his great men and his close acquaintances and his priests, until he left him none remaining." So, as I mentioned, quite a few verses, 1 through 11 here. But the 70 sons, they were the male descendants of Ahab. They were both sons and grandsons. And keep in mind, when you study the Bible in the Old Testament specifically, that when you see sons, it doesn't mean biological sons. It also means descendants. And 1 Kings chapter 20 verse 5 says that Ahab had many wives, therefore he would have many descendants. And since these living relatives could avenge a dead kinsman by killing the person responsible for his death, as seen back in the Avenger chapter of Numbers 35:12, Jehu's life was in jeopardy while Ahab's male descendants survived. And Ahab's surviving family members, they were living in Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom, approximately 25 miles south of Jezreel. And Jehu sent the same message in the number of letters to the royal officials who had likely fled from Jezreel to Samaria, and also the leaders of the tribes of Israel, and those appointed as the custodians and educators of the royal children. And realizing the potential conflict existed between himself and Ahab's family, we see that Jehu was demanding that Ahab's appointed officials either fight to continue the royal line of Ahab, or to select the new king from Ahab's descendants who would fight Jehu in battle, and that would decide which one of the family would rule Israel. And the 2 officials were the palace administrator and the governor of the city, who was the commander of the city's fighting force. And these officials and these leaders, they transferred their allegiance from the house of Omri to Jehu. And as a tangible sign of their surrender, Jehu required that the officials to decapitate all of Ahab's male descendants and to bring their heads to Jehu at Jezreel by the next day. And we see that out of fear, these officials, they obeyed Jehu's order by decapitating the male descendants. However, they did not personally go to Jehu in Jezreel, and they were likely in fear of the similar fate would await them. In Old Testament, once again, very graphic details we can find in these Old Testament passages. But 2 heaps was the practice of piling the heads of conquering subjects at the city gates. It was very common practice in the ancient Near East, especially by the Assyrians. And the practice was designated to deter rebellion. And in verse 9, it said, I conspired and killed. And that was Jehu referring to Joram's homicide back in chapter 9, verse 14 through 24. And God had prophesied through Elijah the destruction of Ahab's house back in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 17 through 24. And we see that Jehu, he goes beyond God's mandate and he executes all of Ahab's officials, a deed for which God later will bring judgment on the house of Jehu in the prophet Hosea chapter 1, verse 4. In verse 12 through 14, it says, And he arose and departed and went to Samaria. On the way at Beth Eked of the shepherds, Jehu met with the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, Who are you? So they answered, We are the brothers of Ahaziah. We have come down to greet the sons of the king and the sons of the queen mother. And he said, Take them alive. So they took them alive and killed them at the well of Beth Eked, 42 men, and he left none of them. So verses 12 through 14 here, since the brothers of Ahaziah, the slain king of Judah, as we looked at in our last video in the verses of 27 through 29, they were killed by the Philistines, as also seen in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 17. And they must have been relatives of Ahaziah in a broader sense, pretty much like cousins or nephews. And the slaughter by Jehu was because these people might have stimulated and strengthened those who were still loyal to the family of Ahab. And he executes 42 members of Ahaziah's family, we see. In verse 15 through 17 says, Now when he departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him, and he greeted him and said to him, Is your heart right as my heart is towards your heart? And Jehonadab answered, It is. Jehu said, If it is, give me your hand. So he gave him his hand, and he took him up to him into the chariot. Then he said, Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So they had him ride in his chariot. And then he came to Samaria. He killed all who remained to Ahab in Samaria till he had destroyed them, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke to Elijah. And so Jehonadab was the son of Rechab, and he was a faithful follower of the Lord, and he was a strict observer of the Mosaic law, leading to the strictness and abstinence. And according to Jeremiah chapter 35, the Rechabites did not plant fields nor drink wine. They shook hands, indicating a pledge of support for Jehu from this influential man. And they were an example of faithfulness and obedience to rebuke his unfaithful and disobedient people. And Jehu wanted to know if Jehonadab was on his side. And Jehonadab was optimistic at the emergence of the energetic reformer, and Jehu was hungry for his approval of this popular religious leader and reformer. And verse 18 through 23 says, Then Jehu gathered all the people together and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants and all his priests. Let no one be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu acted deceptively with the intent of destroying the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu said, Proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. Then Jehu sent throughout all Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there were not a man left who did not come. So they came into the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was full from one end to another. And he said to the one in charge of the wardrobe, Bring out vestments for all the worshippers of Baal. So he brought out vestments for them. Then Jehu and Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal and said to the worshippers of Baal, Search and see that no servants of the Lord are here with you, but only the worshippers of Baal. So verses 18 through 23, though it was in fact a ruse, Jehu promised to outdo Ahab's devotion to Baal. And we see that the people of Samaria might have thought that Jehu was seeking a military and not a religious reformation. And if so, Jehu was seeking Baal's blessing on his reign as king. And the temple of Baal was the idolatrous worship center that Ahab had built in Samaria that we looked at just last month in chapter 16, verse 32 of 1 Kings. And all the worshippers could fit into that one building because the number of Baal devotees had been reduced by the influence of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and also by the neglect and the discontinuance of Baal worship under King Joram. And Jehu pretended devotion to Baal to lure the priests and the worshippers of Baal into a trap. And we see that Jehu wanted to be certain that all the worshippers of the true God were put out of the place. In verse 24 through 28 says, So they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had appointed for himself 80 men on the outside, and had said, If any of the men whom I have brought into your hands escapes, whoever lets him escape, it shall be his life for the life of the other. Now it happened, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, Go in and kill them, let no one come out. And then they killed them with the edge of the sword. And then the guards and the officers threw them out and went in the inner room of the temple of Baal. And they brought the sacred pillars out of the temple of Baal and burned them. And then they broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal and made it a refuse dump to this day. Then Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. So we see that Jehu chose to offer the sacrifice to Baal first, and then he made the call for the execution of the worshippers of Baal. And Ahab built the temple for his wife Jezebel, and here we see Jehu tore it down. And he worked to completely eliminate the worship of Baal from among Israel, making him a unique king over among the other rulers of the northern kingdom. And Israel was steep in idolatry with their first king Jeroboam, who began these false representations of the Lord God with the golden calves seen back in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25 through 33, which we looked at back on January 27th. And following him was Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, until the reign of Ahab. And under King Ahab, Israel moved to a state-supported worship of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29 through 34. And Ahab's son Joram continued this practice until the assassination of Jehu, who destroys the state-sponsored worship of Baal in Israel. And in verse 26, we see the word sacred pillars, and those were speaking of wooden idols distinct from the main image pillar of Baal. And a refused dump meant place of dung. And if you don't know what dung means, it means poop. But this desecration of the site discouraged any rebuilding of the temple of Baal. And basically, he made it a public toilet, if you want to think of it that way. And Jehu did not do this because he was godly or anything. He did not do this to be spiritual or to show godliness. He wanted to destroy the dynasty and the influence of Ahab. And he had in his mindset of killing the last remnant of Ahab's loyalists and incur the support of those in the land who are motivated in worshiping the true God. And Jonadab did not know of that motive, so he concurred with what Jehu did. And verse 29 through 31 says, however, Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. That is, from the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in doing what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your sons shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, for he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin. So, however, we did see here that Jehu did continue to officially sanction other idolatry introduced in the northern kingdom by King Jeroboam back in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28 through 33. In Jehu, we see that he is used to fulfill God's judgment against the house of Ahab, driving the worship of Baal out of Israel. And for this, we see that he's rewarded with a dynasty that would last for 4 generations. And like I said, the prophet Hosea, the minor prophet Hosea, condemned Jehu back in Hosea chapter 1, verse 4. And we see that Jehu carried out God's will, but he exceeded overboard with the execution. And we see that Jehu didn't do this, because he's seeking to please God and to obey God. He did this out of pride and personal glory. And we see that he continued the sinful idolatry of Jeroboam. We see that Jehu was disobedient to the God of Israel and did not serve God. And so that would make Jehu not a perfect Israelite patriot. In verse 32-33, in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel, and Hazael conquered them in all the territory of Israel. From the Jordan eastward, all the lands of Gilead, Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, including Gilead and Bashan. So the Lord allowed neighboring rulers in their kingdoms like Syria to capture parts of the Israel's territory. And because Jehu failed to keep the law of the Lord wholeheartedly, the Lord would punish him by giving him the land to Syria. And this lost region was the homeland of the tribes of Gad and Reuben and half of Manasseh, as we saw back in Numbers chapter 32. And that was due to their sin and unfaithfulness to the covenant. And this included losing Gilead and Bashan. In verse 34 through 36, to wrap up the chapter, now the rest of the acts of Jehu, all that he did and all that his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Jehu rested with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. Then Jehoahaz, his son, reigned in his place. And the period that Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. So that's where chapter end wraps up right here. And we see Jehu in the last verse here, verse 36. He reigned for 28 years, but he was only half-hearted committed. And the 28 years were between the time of 841 to 814 BC. And so to wrap up this video today, we look at Ahab's descendants being executed by Jehu at Jezreel. And we looked at Jehu executing 42 members of Ahaziah's family. And we see that Jehu executed the remainder of Ahab's family at Samaria. And we saw that Jehu arranged a big sacrifice for the false god, the fake god Baal, before he would wipe out the Baal worship in Israel deceptively. And we saw that he had half-hearted or halfway obedience, where he chose to keep one side with idolatry. He had one foot out of idolatry while the other foot was in. And we looked at Syria capturing large portions of Israel's territory, and the ending with the summary of the reign of Jehu. And through Jehu, we can learn that God will bless obedience, and God grants success for those who obey. But God will also pull away a blessing when someone is half-hearted obedient. And one little nugget that I want you to ponder right now is, Christian, you cannot half-heartedly serve God. You are either fully into God or you are not with God. And I know there's a thing, what we call weekend warriors, and I'm not making fun of the National Guard or the reserves, but there are some people that proclaim Christ, they proclaim to be Christians, and they only serve God on Sundays, and then they go out and live like the world 6 days a week. They don't get in their Bibles, they don't pray, they don't do anything in their faith. And I want to look at Matthew chapter 6, verse 24 of a New Testament reading here. In Matthew 6:24, this is the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus, with his followers, and he's speaking about wealth here. But in verse 24, he said, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And what we must realize is that we cannot serve God while holding on to idols and false gods. And where does your allegiance lie? Are you a weekend warrior in the faith? Are you in church on Sundays looking, real religious and looking real good? Or are you living the faith? Are you living for the kingdom of God all the time? And we are now 40% of the way through our study here in the book of 2 Kings. We are slotted to be wrapping up this book right around Easter at this point. And we'll see you next as we're going to look at the preservation of Joash. So King Joash, preservation. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. I'll let you know when our next study will be. God bless.